Amen. You might have been thinking this morning, aren't you done with that you ought to know thing? No, I'm not. Won't be for quite some time, if ever. But I was thinking, at the beginning of September, when we started that series of Bible stories you ought to know, and there's only 5, remember? Just randomly picked them. There's so many more. And I was thinking there are so many more, and so many of those are parables. Those stories that Jesus tells to make a point. Something we can learn from. We'll do a series of parables you ought to know, because there's a lot. Actually depends on how you look at them and what you consider to be a parable, so there's some disagreement as to how many there are, but there's a lot, let's say. And so we're just going to look at a few. And I thought we'll look at some that are really well known, and we'll look at some that maybe are a little less known. And what would be a really good one to start with? Well, one that is super familiar to everyone. The parable that we call the Good Samaritan. And so I thought we'd start with that. Not realizing at the time how events in the world would make it significant. I did think, also, by the way, what are you going to say about that? Because I think what I said initially was we'll do some parables and we'll talk about them in a new and fresh way. What's new and fresh about the parable of the Good Samaritan? Is there anything that you could possibly say that's new or fresh about the parable? It's not like we haven't talked about it before. In fact, when I looked it up, as you may recall, summer of last year, it was in the lectionary, so we talked about it then. And then I looked a little bit further, and it turns out I have either talked about it or written about it more than a half a dozen times in the last few years. So even I've talked about it a lot, and I'm sure you've heard other people talk about it. You may have even read about it. And if you haven't, the odds are good at some point you've seen a story that said, a good Samaritan stopped to help somebody in the news. It's not like we're not familiar with the use of the expression. So first of all, let's just ditch that part right from the start. Because the manner in which we tend to use the expression, a good Samaritan, is simply to refer to somebody who stopped to do something kind for a stranger. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. Remember, one of the things about parables is that there's so many layers to them. And that would be very much a surface layer, but it's still an important layer. In the story, someone stops to help a stranger in need. That's important. Reducing this story to that is probably minimizing what its impact should be, and certainly minimizing what its impact would have been to the first people who heard this story. Bearing in mind, too, that the first people to hear this story from Jesus likely had heard something similar before, just not Jesus' version of it. Right? It's a little bit like hearing the cat in the rhinestone suit. The moment you hear that story, you're probably likely to go, oh, that's the story of the Good Samaritan. Yes, it is. So there's nothing wrong with understanding that the point of the parable is simply be kind to strangers. There's also nothing wrong, by the way, with understanding the parable as being about who your neighbor is, as in everyone is my neighbor. That's a little bit like all lives matter, but that's okay. There's a point at which it's important to remember that everyone is your neighbor. We are one big global family. We are one universal family, in fact. In fact, you could really work that angle quite significantly, too. The thing about those two things is that it gives us the opportunity to go, yeah, that's a great story. They're a little bit generic and universal to the point where we can actually set them aside. It's a good story. But personally, it's not really impacting me at all. And it should. If you were a first century Jew, it sure would be. There's two reasons why this should impact you personally, and it's context and perspective. It's all about context and perspective. And there's two levels to that, isn't there? There's the context and perspective that's in the story, and there's a context and perspective in which you are hearing the story right now. And that's the point at which all stories in the Bible become fresh and new, because you're hearing them now. And your context and mine is what's going on in the world. And that's not just what's going on in the world on the other side of the world that we read about in the news, that we might tend to look at and go, that is a terrible thing, but hey, it's happening over there. I can't do anything about it. Yes, you can. We'll come to that in a minute. The other, though, is your world, the world that's around you. So when you hear this story today, you are hearing it in the context of whatever is going on in your world right now. That's what makes it fresh and new. If you were hearing the story for the first time, what makes the story fresh and new for you is a couple of things. First of all, it's important to remember that when we generalize about the story, like it's important to be kind to strangers, and everyone is my neighbor, we've kind of missed the context in which Jesus tells it. Someone comes to him and says, how do I gain eternal life? And Jesus answers, what's in the law? Making the person who asks the question actually answer their own question. Now, the answer that they give, you've heard before, because it also appears in Matthew and Mark, and it's Jesus answering the question. But here, Luke tells the story in a way that forces the person to answer their own question. And there's a reason for that, and that is that Luke doesn't want you to pay attention to the generality of everyone is your neighbor and it's important to be kind to be strangers. Luke wants it to be personal. Luke wants you to connect with this story with the meaning of love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself in a very personal way. And so Jesus has the man answer the question for himself, and then, of course, the man doesn't want to leave it there, and he says, so who is my neighbor? And that's what Luke is after. Who is my neighbor? Jesus tells this story. And at the end of the story, Jesus says, so, which person in the story was being a neighbor to the other? And here's an interesting thing. The answer isn't the Samaritan. The answer is the person who showed mercy. So there's a couple of things there. First of all, that's actually the point. But also, the person answering that question didn't want to say Samaritan. Because, as I'm sure you've heard, Samaritans were the enemies of the Jews. But again, it's really easy to say that and let it go as, well, they were just enemies. Except they weren't just enemies, they were very personal enemies. Because Samaritans were Jews. Samaritans were Jews who believed differently. Samaritans were Jews who believed that they were the inheritors of the true inheritors of the law. In fact, you may not be aware of this, but the word Samaritan doesn't just mean someone who came from Samaria. It comes from a Greek word, which comes from an ancient Hebrew word that means keeper or guardian. The safekeeper of the law, in other words, is how Samaritans would see themselves. But a priest and a Levite are the other two characters in the story. Wouldn't you think that a priest would know the law? Well, I certainly hope so. And a Levite, Levites were, they were traditionally from the tribe of Levi, but they were the people who took care of the rituals in the temple. They were temple workers who needed to know the law, especially when it came to how they performed the rituals in the temple. And that was very strict. So you would think a Levite would know the law too. All three characters in the story know the law. So did the person who asked the question in the first place. Love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself. All three of them should have known the law, but only one of them lived it. So first of all, the point of the story isn't about knowing the law, it's about living it. And in order to make that particularly personal, Jesus makes the character who does it a Samaritan, somebody who would have been a very personal enemy. Not just somebody who lives in another country that they'd had, some sort of fight with, but somebody that came from your own tradition and went a different way. That's personal. And that's the person who's being a neighbor. It's not about who is my neighbor out there so that I can treat them a certain way. It's about me being a neighbor. It's about you being a neighbor to others. It's not contingent. Your behavior isn't contingent on other people being your neighbor. It is solely contingent on you being a good neighbor to others. And that doesn't come from behavior. That comes from not only knowing the law, that would be behavior, but living it into the world. And how often do we hear Jesus talk about living from the heart? Best line in the story earlier, right at the very end, remember? It's about living from your heart. That's what the law is about. That's why Jesus and the man in this version of the story gets to say, love God with all your heart and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as you would love yourself. Know the love that's in you and live that into the world. That's a very personal thing. It's not something you can put on the shelf and go and say, I know, yep, I'll get there sooner or later. It's something to live right now. It would be very easy now to put that in the context of world events and go, if only those people could just remember that and be good neighbors to each other. Yeah, but I can't do anything about that. The thing is, you can, and that's why Jesus likes to tell these parables in this very personal way, is because it starts with you and me. It doesn't start with us going, those people should know better. It starts with us going, what am I going to do in my little piece of the world? How am I going to live? And when we are neighbors to each other, our little circle of neighbors grows into a bigger circle of neighbors that grows into a bigger circle of neighbors. We can have an impact just by starting there. That's one of the great things about the parables that Jesus tells, and why it's a really good thing to start with one that might be familiar, one that we have taken into a different context by turning the expression, the Good Samaritan, into something both bigger and much smaller than it is. It's about you and me. It's not you, it's me. It is. That's really the point of what this story is. Because what does Jesus say at the end? Go and, you know the answer, go and do it. It's not enough just to know it, we have to live it. That's a bit of a struggle. That's always a bit of a struggle, because sooner or later we're going to encounter somebody we want to be a neighbor to who's not going to be as grateful as the cat in the story. Or, as we are assuming, the man in the story is. For all we know, the man in the story could have been really resentful of the Samaritan's help because he was a Samaritan. But it doesn't matter, does it? Because that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is what the Samaritan did. We love most those who it is hardest to love, is what Jesus asks of us. We already know that everyone is our neighbor. We already know that. We all know that we are all children of God. We already know that. Don't always live that way, but we should know that. We are all connected. We say these things literally every week. Literally every week. Every day even. The point of this story is it's not enough to say them. It's not enough to know them. We need to live them. And that is not dependent on who we are sharing that with. It's dependent on us and what's in our hearts and how we are living that into the world, because what is there is love.